So in this part of the lecture, we're going to look at what is the modern trend in thinking about international law. This idea of, is it positive law? Is it natural law? Well, we know that the modern trend, and when I say modern, we're talking about the last 100 years, has been from a system based on natural law to a system that is based on positive law. So this is the modern trend of how international law is developing. We are moving from natural law principles to positive law principles. And it's not always in a straight line. And as we'll see, there are ebbs and flows to the importance of international law, and especially positivist international law. But we start with World War I. Now, if you were ever to ask yourself, what was World War I about? Why were the parties fighting? What was the core of World War I? Well, you might find out that it's not an easy answer. And it wasn't an easy answer at the time. No one was quite sure what World War I was about. Well, in an odd situation, World War I actually, one could say that it resulted from the growth of positive law. Now, positive law, when we talk about it from an international law perspective, is often based on the idea of treaties. A treaty is a set of rules that two countries will adopt to govern relationships between those two treaties. So if my neighbor is attacked and I have a treaty with that neighbor, I may be called upon to go to that neighbor's defense. Now you could argue that there's a natural law principle as well to say, like, well, if someone was attacked, then we owe the world the obligation to assist that country. But we don't have to rely on those natural law principles if we execute a treaty. So what we saw was from the beginning of the 20th century through up till, say, World War I, that time period, we saw a number of nations entering into treaties with one another. They entered into these positive law arrangements. And what we saw was this one event, and you've probably heard about the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, led to this cascading entry into a massive conflict. Because when the Archduke was murdered, then that brought Austria into the war, and their allies came into the war, and then those allies may invade other countries, which then brings other people into the war, and pretty soon we have this massive conflagration of events without a reason why, based solely on these underlying treaty obligations, this positive law obligations. Now, World War I, the end of World War I, also brought about some broad changes in international law. And probably the most important was the foundation of the League of Nations, in which this international organization was going to substitute international authority for the use of force. That we were going to rely no longer on the use of violence and war to make policy, but instead we were going to rely on adjudication, a court system, arbitration panels, that we're going to substitute international authority for the use of war as a means of public policy. And in fact, we saw the Geneva Convention, one of the early examples of international positivist law, in which it formulated rules about how do we conduct ourselves in war. And so this idea of there are rules that govern how you conduct a war, well, that was pretty dramatic. And I think most countries would have said, yeah, there are rules, but those rules would have been vague and based upon natural law principles. But with the Geneva Convention, this example of positive law, we put it down. This is how you interact. This is what you can do. This is what you cannot do. This is how you treat prisoners of war. All of those things come out of positive law. Treaties after World War I often limited the legal right of a state to pursue war as an instrument of policy. That in fact, countries should not use war as a means of attaining policy goals. So we had this time period, however, in which, because the United States refuses to join the League of Nations, this concept of maybe international authority is not what it is cracked up to be. And so after those first early optimistic years, after the end of World War I, we saw much less respect for the idea of international law. When the United States refused to join the League of Nations, and then eventually other states will leave the League because we know that that the international authority may not work. But of course, what we saw was when we abandoned those international legal principles was, guess what? We're back at war. We're back in a state of war. So 30 years later, we're back at war in World War II. Now, after World War II concluded, we saw the rise of international organizations, obviously the United Nations. We saw the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, founded in 1947. We saw a number of branches of the United Nations. And what we saw after World War II is that the rise of these international organizations meant that international law was no longer just for the states. That international law was going to be the law that governed not only how states interacted with one another, but how states interacted with the international community. What else did we see after World War II? Well, we saw many more non-Western states join the family of nations, and this is going to have big consequences for the growth of international law. Up until World War II, when we talked about international law, they were very Western principles, Western Europe, Anglo-American principles that were applied to the world as a whole. Well, after World War II, when we saw the growth of non-Western states, then international law had to grow and adapt to include concepts that were relevant to these non-Western states. What we also saw after World War II was a gap between developed and less developed countries, and this created a demand for a new economic order. And so the economic order that we have today in terms of international trade, well, the basis for this was set back after the end of World War II. This idea of nations cooperating not simply to affect do we go to war or not, but instead nations cooperating to build a new economic order. And this all came out of those developments after World War II. Of course, World War II was quickly followed by the Cold War. The Cold War could be said to start in 1947. The Cold War played a role in the development of international law. Now, the Cold War was actually fought in two different stages and two time periods. And the first phase of the Cold War could be called the containment era. And the containment era lasted from 1947 to approximately 1980. And in this stage, of course, the Cold War, if you're not familiar with it, was this conflict, a political conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union, the United States and its allies, and the Soviet Union and its allies. But it also was a conceptual conflict as to what was going to be the dominant political order of the planet, as well as what was going to be the dominant economic order of the planet. So not only did you have these political affairs of the United States versus the Soviet Union, but you also had this idea of capitalism versus communism. And what's going to be the dominant economic era? Well, as this conflict, the Cold War, developed, the United States embarked on a policy in which it determined that it would contain communism to the greatest extent possible. That the idea was not to defeat communism, but to contain it, to not allow it to spread. And one of the tools that was used during the containment era was the idea of positive law, executing treaties with other countries that were meant to ensure those countries remained friendly to the interests of the United States and its allies, and hostile to the interest of the Soviet Union and its allies. And at the same time, the Soviet Union was doing the same thing. And so in this containment era, we actually saw a growth in positive law. Now, this is not to say that there weren't a lot of shady deals going on, things that were not open and transparent like we think of international law, or the way we think of positive law. But positive law was the foundational basis for the containment era. Let's execute treaties and enter into agreements that ensure that our side's interests prevail. Now, the containment era lasted, as I said, up to 1980, or you could say 1981, with the election of Ronald Reagan. And this period, from 1980 to 1991, we could call the subversion era. And the subversion era comes about because many in the U.S. thought that the Cold War was a loss, that here we had acted to contain the growth of communism. We had spent untold millions of dollars. We had fought the Korean War. We had fought the Vietnamese War. And what do we have to show for it? Well, nothing really changed. And so in this second phase of the Cold War, the idea was we were going to not just contain communism, but we were going to subvert it by any means possible, including those means that are not part of positive law. So obviously the best example of this would be the United States assistance to the freedom fighters in Afghanistan after the Soviet Union had invaded the country and occupied it. The United States funded many of these elements, these resistance elements, which coincidentally went on to become the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. That's an example of the law of unintended consequences. But we didn't do that from a positive law perspective. We did it under the table. That was meant to subvert the communist effort. Well, we saw this also in the American continent in Nicaragua. Nicaragua had elected a government that was friendly to communist principles, to the Soviet Union. And so the United States engaged in assisting these rebels in Nicaragua to fight the government. Now, they did not do that openly. They didn't do it from a positive law perspective, but that was on purpose. They were trying to subvert communism. So we saw a growth in positive law following World War II and into the Cold War, and then we saw a retreat from those concepts in the subversion era. Of course, events after the Cold War affected the development of international law as well. You could say the Cold War ended with the breakup of the Soviet Union in 1991. And when the Soviet Union failed, which caught everybody by surprise, by the way, no one knew, no one saw it coming. But what the end of the Cold War did was to bring renewed vigor to the idea of international public law. And we saw it almost immediately in another war, which is the first Gulf War, when Iraq invaded Kuwait, and a large coalition of the international community, world powers, came together militarily to repel Iraq from Kuwait. And this first Gulf War, I often say, was a triumph of international law principles, because it brought together different states, different political systems, different languages, different cultures, and together they agreed to enforce the idea of territorial integrity, that one sovereign state could not invade another sovereign state. And oftentimes after the war, President Bush, Bush the First, was criticized for failing to go to Baghdad and to remove Saddam Hussein from power. But the first President Bush was following international law principles that said that to do that would then violate the territorial integrity, the sovereignty of Iraq, and that's not what they were there for. They were there to reinstate, to reassert the sovereignty of Kuwait. So after the Cold War, we saw a renewed vigor to international public law, and this continued throughout the 1990s. The first Gulf War involved this large coalition of diverse nations who were operating under a UN mandate, a United Nations resolution, saying, yeah, we should repel the invaders from Kuwait. But we did see another thing that came into play really starting in the late 90s, and that's the idea of the humanitarian war. And the humanitarian war has remained relevant, and increasingly so, within the last 20 years. The humanitarian war was an idea that came out of the fall of the Cold War, and the idea that, look, we've got all of these armies, we've got all of this military might out there, and we have countries that are doing bad things to their own citizens, and therefore we should use war as an instrument of international law to assist those individual citizens who are being abused by their home state, by their own country. And we saw this, of course, in the former Yugoslavia, in Bosnia, in Kosovo, in the late 1990s, in which the belief was the Serbian government was committing genocide, ethnic cleansing of ethnic Bosnians and ethnic Albanians within its own borders. And so the United States and its allies in NATO conducted a war against Serbia under the authority of this is the humanitarian thing to do. The humanitarian war is the way of using those old Cold War ideas to spread good things, to spread good deeds. So this humanitarian war, the idea that war as a humanitarian effort, which of course would have been completely foreign to those people deciding what the rules of war should be after World War I, the humanitarian war had a lot of appeal. Well, let's go to war. Let's give NATO a mission. Since the Soviet Union has collapsed and NATO's original mission is gone, well, let's give it a new mission. It's going to be a humanitarian war machine. And the humanitarian war idea was reasserted in the early 2000s with the Second Gulf War. And if you've read the histories or read about it, the idea of the Second Gulf War was we're going to liberate Iraq from its own government. We are going to free the Iraqi people from their own government. And so we do that because it's the humanitarian thing to do. The humanitarian war came into effect again, and as a excuse or a reason for the war in Libya in 2011, when the United States and its European allies bombed Libya and essentially removed Muammar Gaddafi, the leader of Libya, and then all chaos breaks loose. But the idea is that, well, it was necessary, it was justified by the need to use the army for humanitarian means. All of which leads us up to 9/11. And after 9/11, there's a movement away from international law. The United States saw itself as having values that were different from the rest of the world. And because it was now the sole superpower, then it eroded the need for cooperation with other countries. And so much of the need for international cooperation was removed because the United States was the only superpower.